Hi guys, welcome back to Perspective Podcast. Today we've got 3 lovely guests with us, and we're going to be chatting a little bit about sustainability, covering topics about cars and concrete and what's the one I'm missing?
Maybe farming if we've got time.
Do you guys want to go down and just introduce yourselves and say a little fact about you?
Oh, you've hit us with that one. I'm Jack. I do BSc product design, and the fact about me is I've broken every ligament in my body.
Brilliant.
Every?
Yeah.
Every bone. Surely there's
Four.
quite a few.
Forearms. Well, you got 4 ligaments, isn't it? Or have I got that wrong? Not ligament. This is going to make me look stupid when it comes out. I've forgotten the word for it now. Anyway, I've broken my arms 4 times and broken both legs.
Oh,
Nice.
I'm Will, and I've never broken a bone.
Nice.
I'm Ben. I do product and furniture design. And a fun fact about me, I like a lot of protein and chicken.
That's true.
Nice.
Really
My name's Ella, and my fun fact about myself is my name's not Ella. There we go. Do you guys want to kick off about concrete and the sustainability of that? What have you guys found out? So Ben, you're doing your major project on concrete, and
Yeah.
do you want to speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I'm looking into like finding a more sustainable alternative to standard concrete materials, and I'm looking into biochar, which is basically like incinerating food waste and timber offcuts to produce this kind of like charcoal-like substance and replace like standard aggregates. Yeah.
What have you found out about, I guess, the industry so far?
Standard concrete produces like the most amount of carbon dioxide in like all industry. Like for the fact that it produces about 42 billion tons of carbon dioxide every year.
Which industry, sorry?
Concrete. So like
the building industry?
Essentially, yeah.
Okay.
The making of all the materials and stuff produces that amount of carbon dioxide, which is terrible. Even though there's a massive focus on sort of plastic.
Yeah, and no one realises it's that bad in any way.
Not at all.
Okay, so we're all doing different dissertations. Do you just want to go through and kind of give a little bit of a summary about what you're researching at the moment? So, Jack?
Yeah. So my diss is on vertical farming, looking at, obviously there's a massive issue in farming at the moment to do with climate crisis and environmental impacts and things like that. And it feels like there's a turning point in farming. And do we solve those problems that they have now, or is there a new solution coming through? And one of those solutions is vertical farming. So I'm looking into all those. It's a really cool process, and just sort of analysing if that is the correct process and step forward, and what are the challenges and drawbacks with that. And did you want a cool fact to do with it?
Yeah, go for it.
Saves 95% of the water used. Is basically, it uses 95% less water than current arable farming, if not more, sometimes 99 to 97%, which is very interesting and very cool.
Nice. And Will, what's yours about?
So my dissertation's about sort of the modern automobile. So consumer cars mainly is what I'm looking at, and how technological advancements have changed over recent years, sort of the last 10, 15 years. Obviously including the upcoming 2035 electric vehicle mandate, and as well as just general features which you'll find in brand new cars which maybe you didn't 10 years ago. It sort of poses the question, has the technological advancements gone too far, and are certain features in the modern car useless or distracting, or just not necessary in general, basically?
Nice, that's really interesting. And Ben, what's yours about?
So my dissertation's about kind of like Jack's, looking at farming, but instead it's more looking at like homegrown farming and how we could basically rejuvenate public parks and spaces for sort of publicly accessible gardening. to help with like social vulnerabilities like food insecurity, and what can be done is sort of through government to sort of fund that and stuff. Yeah, it's really interesting.
Will, I wonder if we can just jump into kind of your diss and what you found out so far about the automobile industry.
Well, so at the moment, obviously, there's a huge push from government and corporations to adopt electric vehicles. If you don't already know, there's a mandate which comes into place in 2035. It was 2030, but it got pushed back 5 years. Basically, it states that any vehicles produced and sold in the UK after that, in terms of consumer vehicles, I'm sure it doesn't include agriculture or commercial vehicles. I think actually no, it's things like cars and vans have to be electric or zero emission. So whether that means obviously plug-in or potentially like a hydrogen alternative fuel, for example. And as well, with that, I've looked at how various features are changing the way that people own their cars, are changing the way that people drive their cars as well. So, for example, the introduction of a lot of autonomous features, such as like automatic lane assist and braking systems, which essentially are pushing towards having autonomous vehicles.
Yeah, because that's a massive thing that Tesla's trying to push, isn't it? With they're massively advertised in their cars, isn't it, about automation and AI, isn't it?
Yeah.
But it's weird, all these big companies always push these things, but it's like just the rules and regulations and governments just don't keep up with them. Especially you look at like the electrics at the moment. It just feels like all these electric cars come in, and obviously you got the 2035 agreement, but then it's like, well, the infrastructure just isn't there and just hasn't caught up yet. And like you look in London and all those big cities, yeah, cool, you've got all the electric charging, but then you go out into the country somewhere and there's nothing there.
Exactly.
And there's no infrastructure for those people to I don't know, to charge their cars or even just to fix them. Because okay, your electric car breaks down, where are you actually going to take it to be fixed?
Yeah, exactly. But even like the working class people, like you said about vans needing to be like zero emissions, it's like working class people can't afford
No.
the infrastructure needed to charge their cars all the time.
Well,
vans. So
actually, funny enough, 2 points I've got there. So in terms of the infrastructure, I do agree. I think rurally it's going to cause a big issue to begin with. But as a whole, the government have really been pushing the adoption or the increase in infrastructure for it. So just a statistic that I'd found. So like the UK had committed £500 million toward building its EV charging network. And it's sort of, at the moment, it's increasing 30%. The infrastructure that we have is increasing 30% annually. So obviously for right now, if we all just switched to electric cars, it probably wouldn't hold. But for the growth in electric car sales at the moment and where they're hoping us to be at 2035, I think it might actually come through and be enough. But obviously as well, we've got to consider that come 2035, most people aren't going to be able to afford to buy a brand new car then. And so likelihood is these people will still be owning petrol, diesel, internal combustion cars. So, because ultimately they're not going to get rid of petrol stations and diesel stations for another like many years after that. It's just the new cars that will have to be electric. So whilst obviously I believe the government hope for 80% of all new cars and vans at 2030 to be electric, there still will be a market for internal combustion vehicles.
Yeah.
As well as obviously like the used market as well.
You can see that market absolutely booming as well. Because who's going to have the money to afford these new cars when you could go and buy a second-hand
Exactly.
refurbished car for half the price?
So as well on that one, from what I found, I believe that actually I wasn't really looking into it, but I sort of found it through investigation that I think that the way that we own cars at the moment is going to change massively, because obviously with the increase in things like PCP at the moment, which is car financing, which basically spreads the cost of your car's depreciation over the space of 2 to 4 years, and then you're given the option at the end of it to pay like a balloon sum, which is usually maybe like £6,000, which is sort of, or however much the car is expected to be valued at the time of when the lease ends. So essentially, people will buy these cars and they'll never actually really own them. It'll always be on lease from the companies. And so after these 3 years, they'll send them back to the manufacturers, and then they'll upgrade and get a newer car, which I think is a massive thing that we're going to see in the future, given things like battery degradation from electric vehicles, as well as the technological advancements which we're seeing in cars are outdating a lot quicker.
That's a big thing you're seeing at the moment as well. Teslas made 10 years ago are just nothing compared to the ones made now. And they're starting to fall apart as well. And then that sort of leads on to, well, what do you do with the waste? Where does it go? Because, yeah, an electric car is great at the moment, but in 30 years' time, when you've got loads and loads of cars breaking down, where do the batteries go? Tesla's got, what, 800, 700 batteries in them? Insane. All along the chassis floor.
It is huge. It's and obviously with electric cars, we've gone from the most expensive part of the car being the engine or like transmission and whatnot to being the battery. A lot of companies, well, the EU released rules to state that if batteries fall and degrade below a certain percentage but within 8 years of their purchase, the manufacturer has to replace it.
Yeah.
So that obviously offers the consumer a lot more safety in their purchases, because I know that I'd be very conscious of the fact that the battery's just going to end up failing or whatever.
Do you feel like there's going to be like planned obsolescence within manufacturers to allow their batteries to last for like 8 years, and then on the 9th year, 10th year, batteries start to fail?
Definitely.
So, yeah.
I mean,
it's an inevitability.
You look at the smartphone as well.
Exactly. Ultimately, with batteries, there's always going to be degradation, because like Jack said, take the smartphone. Within, I think it's something like 500 charges cycle. After that point, your battery is going to be nowhere near as strong or sturdy, which is about the 2-year guarantee. But like with an electric car, most people who'll buy outright a vehicle will end up keeping it for at least 5 years. And so that circles back to the new way of owning vehicles.
Yeah. Or it might be one of those things where you buy this car, okay, this part breaks down, but the company that sold it to you are the only suppliers of this one part.
Exactly.
And you're sort of just locked in that cycle. Because iPhones have had planned obsolescence in them. But you just scale it up to a car. You're going to make so much more profit off it if you do. Exactly. So you see no reason why they wouldn't include that in some way.
I think with planned obsolescence, definitely it can get a little bit conspiracy theory, because
that's very true.
Ultimately, even in any car, there's always going to be planned obsolescence, whether it's deliberate or not. It might just be cheaply made parts that fail, which obviously reflects badly on the company in question, but it's always going to happen. It happens with every single consumer item that you'll have. And ultimately, degradation and wear and tear is going to happen.
Yeah.
It's weird because, like, I've got my car, I've got an old Fiesta, it's 20 years old, and it's absolutely fine. And if, like, I would more likely buy a car that's older, because I feel like it would have been designed better and would last longer than something I bought in 2018, 2019, for example.
I think there's definitely we've seen like a decrease recently. And basically, I think so for example, your car, 20-year-old Fiesta, it's got many rudimentary features. You'll have things like ABS in there. You'll have a lot of the safety features, airbags, you've got seat belts, everything that essentially the fundamentals of a car, and then extras. You've got radios. I'd imagine you've got like electric windows, and
no. It's so old.
or within like potentially like a car that had a slightly higher spec, maybe it would have at that point. But ultimately, we'd seen come around sort of the 2010s, we'd seen a massive increase in technology added into the car, such as like touch screens and various safety things. The issue with that is obviously your car, whilst it is old, the features within it are timeless and they've carried it through. And so the same as like mine, I've got a 2013 Polo. It's very basic. It's got radio, electric windows, all safety equipment, airbags, and everything that you'd sort of like the bare minimum. But ultimately, it's not that dated, despite the fact it doesn't have like a touchscreen or anything. But whereas you look at the newer cars that have these touchscreens and things like Apple CarPlay, that it will come to a point where these technologies don't translate as well. Whereas, so like our cars, for example, you can connect to the radio through whatever means necessary, like transmitters or whatever, play your phone audio through the radio, and with a phone mount, you've got a sat nav.
Yeah. Do you feel like, what's kind of like the waste in this industry? Have you looked into that in your dissertation? Like, obviously, there'll be a lot more waste coming from newer vehicles, especially if they're going to have parts that fail quicker than older vehicles. Have you looked into kind of like the waste stream from that industry?
So when talking to experts, basically, obviously, battery degradation. One of the biggest concerns about electric cars is the waste of batteries and the production of batteries. Well, the whole scale, essentially. So starting at the bottom, it used to be a 1:1:1 ratio of cobalt, manganese, and nickel. They've improved that by using 8:1:1 of nickel, manganese, and cobalt. Nickel being obviously the cheapest element within the battery. So it's reducing the cost for one of batteries to be produced. And secondly, recently there's been a huge developments in battery recycling. So as before, sort of things such as like lithium-ion batteries would sort of just have to be disposed of or put in like a safe disposal area and just left really to deteriorate. But there's new technologies now which can actually separate the individual parts of batteries, which will then help reintroduce them and recycle them into newer cars. But I don't know if I answered your question.
There's still so much waste within making them as well, though, because you just think of all the pollution
absolutely
that is used within it, and where do they get all the battery stuff from? It's not great.
Though I will say, ultimately, it's whilst actually, electric cars aren't new, they're not necessarily a new technology nowadays. They've been around for a while, and in actual fact, electric cars were around before internal combustion, but obviously with limited range and a very limited electric infrastructure back in like the early 1900s. It just wasn't feasible, and there was no way you could use them rurally. And so obviously, like the Ford Model T skyrocketed and did amazingly because it meant that you could get about. So it's not a new technology, but it is still consistently improving. And I think that now that we've been forced this mandate, instead of it being sort of a side project for a lot of these companies are realizing that they're making huge pollutants. They're going to have to pay more for the waste that they have to get rid of. And so ultimately not only is it in the best interest of the environment, it's in the best interest of these corporations who make these vehicles to reduce that as much as possible. And so as we're seeing, like 10 years ago, we had the Tesla, which wasn't massively efficient and in actual fact made losses with each Tesla sold. Tesla lost money through their process of creating it. But gradually, as in the last 15 years, they've made their production so much more efficient that it means that they're then cutting out these little losses here and there. And I think that we are still essentially, whilst I say it's not a new technology, I think that it's definitely improving, and we are still very much in the dark ages. We've still got a massive ways to go until we actually see something that's efficient, like a fine-tuned watch or whatever.
But also, I was going to add, you have all these new cars coming in. Okay, everyone's got to have an electric car, or they've got to be producing cars by 2035. 50 years, when everyone or most people have got electric cars, where's all the energy actually going to come from to power those electric cars?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, because like the national grid is not prepared at all.
Yeah.
It's going to be billions of people with fucking more cars, and
it might be prepared. It might be prepared in like 10, 15 years. But it's like, but where's it all going to come from? Because it can't all come from solar unless you start covering everything with solar.
Yeah, every field in the UK just with solar panels.
Yeah, and it was like that thing in Canada. They were looking at trying to turn loads of logging trucks into efficient electric trucks, but it was like the power needed just to run, I don't know how many hundreds of trucks within this one part of Canada was, I think it was significantly more than what this isn't very factual information, but they're building a dam, and it's taken them like 10, 15 years to make it, and that one dam can't provide enough power to charge all these trucks. And it's just like, well, you want all this new electronic technology, but it just feels like we just haven't got the power to do that, or sort of turn into that future yet.
I think that from what I'd sort of heard from professionals as well, because obviously with an internal combustion engine, you're always going to be coughing out the pollutants. Like it will ultimately, but with a zero emission vehicles, specifically like an electric vehicle, you're going to have to get the power from somewhere, whether that be coal power or something. It does shift the emissions elsewhere in the production line, which obviously, as you say, yes, it is a concern that we're not going to actually have enough power, and that ultimately the power is not green energy that we're using. But like I say, I think that is a case of for now, if you know what I mean. Yeah. So for now, we've got this poor energy. We've got this poor, the question raised of, is the energy that we're using to charge our electric vehicles green energy? Possibly not. But the simple fact of the matter is there is alternatives. Whereas with a combustion engine, even like a hybrid, which yes, hybrids are much more efficient. They are way less polluting, and honestly, in my opinion, I think potentially a better option than jumping straight into EV. They still produce carbon dioxide and other harmful greenhouse gases.
Yeah, I'm going to jump on that and say as well, I need to look it up, but I think it's the 7 largest ships in the world, all the big container ships, produce more CO2 emissions than all the cars in the world. And it's like, it annoys me a little bit because it feels like they don't start with the most polluting thing because it's going to make such a big impact. But why not start with things like that? And this sort of leads into construction as well with concrete. Just why don't you start looking at all these big pollutants first before trying to turn the market
start
around
at the top and work down?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
but it's like how they played on the whole sort of plastic being the biggest polluter, and then through like research found that plastic since the 1960s has produced about 60 billion tons of carbon dioxide, which is obviously huge and terrible for the environment. But it's the fact that concrete industry alone produces that every 2 years.
Which
is crazy.
No one knows that.
With
no
like CO2 production in concrete, for example, though, versus plastic, is it not really the other implications from using plastic? So whereas concrete will like break down into dust and whatnot, I don't really know, but it will break down. But whereas I feel like a lot of the issue maybe with plastics as an alternative is the fact that they will last thousands of years in our soil. Whereas I'm not sure about concrete, because obviously it's not my dissertation, but...
No, but I think it's the issue that while there are alternative, there's better materials that could be used rather than concrete. And there's a massive focus on plastic and how it's getting into the seas and the amount of plastic that's being produced and the carbon emissions emitted from producing it. But then concrete is 10 times fold that. And that needs to be dealt with, because you might be able to offset plastic production and get rid of that, but then concrete is still producing 10 times more than that all the time. So
does it not seem a bit like sort of comparing apples and pears is my only consideration? Because like what they say that it's like in every bite of food we're consuming plastic, but like surely we don't have the same issue with concrete. Obviously it's all around us, we're sat in a concrete room at the moment, but
yeah, I get what you're saying. I think like at an individualistic level, I'm sure plastic is going to be affecting individuals more.
But more with like CO2 release.
But overall release of carbon dioxide and the amount that's being produced from humans, concrete is 10 times more. And that ultimately affects us more. That affects everyone more than probably plastic does, because it ultimately contributes to global warming, which affects everyone, is going to affect far more people than plastic, which you can take a certain amount of plastic out of your life. You can avoid plastic packaging, you can stop using plastic cutting boards, but concrete production is still going to be going.
Yeah, and ultimately, every house is going to have concrete in it somewhere, and also.
Yeah, I just think there's obviously massive issues in all industries. For example, like if it's concrete or if it's farming or if it's, the car industry. And kind of just to wrap up, why don't you all are you like, where do you feel like, I guess, let's stick with the automobile industry. Like, where do you think it will be in 2035? Do you think it's an encouraging thing, or do you think it's kind of like a shot in the dark? If you could just give like a little summary each of like what you think or where it's going.
So I think by 2035, there could be a chance they push it back to 2040, because it was meant to be 2030 originally. But at some point, I reckon when it does come through, you'll have all the big corporations making electric cars. I think that most towns will have infrastructure, but I don't think you'll have rural villages with the infrastructure for it. I think you'll have a lot of older people refusing, or not refusing, but probably sticking with the cars they already have. And I think the big thing is the infrastructure, but also just everything else. Like when you break your car, you need to go to the got the word for it?
Mechanic.
Thank you. The mechanics, just to fix it. And I think you won't have enough people to change that into electronics. And I think so. You can have a lot of people using their old cars, if not buying refurbished second-hand cars.
Yeah.
Like you look at phones, there's a massive market now for second-hand phones refurbished, because it's so expensive to buy them brand new.
Did you feel like that would be the same with the
I think
car
there's
industry?
a chance with it, yeah. Or at least a lot of people going back to petrol. Obviously it depends on petrol prices, but I don't think it will be like 80% of people are driving electric cars by 2035. I don't think that will happen. I think you'll sort of wear out the petrol market until there's no more of it left, and then you've got to turn to electronic. And even by then, I don't think you'll have infrastructure. I don't know, like in the Highlands of Scotland, you can never see there being an EV station up there for people.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I think that's what it will look like.
Cool. Well,
my opinion's changed quite a lot actually on it since writing my dissertation. I don't know if I completely agree with the total move to it, but I agree something kind of needs to happen. Like what Jack was saying, in terms of the infrastructure, I think surprisingly, I was quite surprised at how much the infrastructure's improved in recent years. So I think I said earlier, like annually there's a 30% increase in all of the infrastructure at the moment, and I think that gradually there'll come a point where the infrastructure that we have already for combustion engines, such as a petrol station, for example, we'll see less of them. But where there is already your Shell, your BP, they will also, I think what we'll see is these companies will incorporate electric charging, and then gradually it will turn into these little forecourts, maybe even shopping areas, because obviously it takes half an hour to charge a car. We'll see these shopping areas become a lot more prevalent, where you sort of park up, plug in your car, go grab yourself a coffee, and then come back instead of petrol stations. And as well, I think, as I was saying earlier, I think that we can still expect a lot more improvement from the electric car, because obviously, I think at the moment we're comparing them. The biggest issue is that the consumer compares an electric vehicle to an internal combustion engine or a petrol engine at the moment. But with a petrol engine on its own, yes, whilst they're not ridiculously bad, they are still they've got years of development behind them. They've gotten to a point where they are very efficient, but whereas we've not seen that yet from electric vehicles, where sort of the pioneers have only really had the last 10 years. I think in the next 20 years we will see massive improvements in electric vehicles. I think we'll see larger ranges, faster charging times, and maybe even new battery technology as well.
Ben, do you want to give a little sum up?
Yeah, well, I think that sort of this idea of suddenly trying to get rid of all petrol cars is just unfeasible. I think maybe a better way of doing it, and I think would hope that they'd enforce something more like this, of going down the route like the Netherlands, where they've sort of tried to reduce the amount of cars completely by just replacing it with bicycles and stuff. And obviously it's difficult with the amount how spread out the UK is, but places like London could massively benefit from
or just improve
having
public
bikes.
transport.
Yeah,
well, that's
improving public transport
that's
would massively reduce
ULEZ,
combustion cars.
But then there are loads of problems with
Exactly. So
that's a whole other podcast episode.
Let's do that.
Well, thank you guys for coming on.
Thanks for having us.
Also, I'd just like to say the 7 ship, that was actually disproven, so don't listen to what I just said about the ships. It's wrong.
But yeah, thanks for coming on, and thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.